Good morning again, everyone, and welcome to the information session for the MPhil with Specialization in Critical Accounting degree program. If you are here, then you are someone who has asked yourself the question, what role should accountants play in society? And you would like to find out a little bit more. So I'm seeing now, and I realize that some people have joined us virtually, but it was a physical event. And so I think they maybe just misunderstood. So that's why, you look around and yeah, but either way, we're going to get the information out there and then we'll be able to inform the others as well. So as I said, this is a pioneering, one-of-a-kind program that challenges individuals in the accounting and auditing professions to do a little bit more and become more involved in societal change. And so those are the conversations that are going to be going on today. It's a nice and quick event. So by 9 o'clock, we're going to be out of this venue. I can assure you that. But without further ado, I'd like to invite the director of the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute, which hosts this program, Professor Derek de Jong, to say a few words. Yes. So.
Good morning, everybody. And also from my side, a warm word of welcome for those of you who have faced this very chilly Joburg morning. And for us who already stood up like 5 o'clock to catch the train, special word of welcome to all of us. Thank you very much for joining. And as Elma said, the message will go out as wide as possible. We will capture everything and then hopefully get the interest even going from there onwards. So as Elma said, my name is Derek de Jong and I head up the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute. The Institute's been around for, we realized just now, 15 years. So next year we'll be celebrating 15 years of the Institute. The Institute is located in the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences. So this is not a GIBS event. This is an Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute event, although GIBS, as you know, belongs to UP, and we thought that we're going to be attracting a Joburg crowd, which we have indeed. So just a bit about the Institute. The vision of the Institute is simply to reimagine leadership. Our mission is to try and pursue our research, our engagement, and our broader teaching and learning in support of social, environmental, and economic justice. So the issue of justice is main to us, and it's crucial to us in terms of the work we do. Obviously, I think you'll agree that the world is probably experiencing unprecedented challenges at the moment. This is not new to us. It cuts across environmental challenges, societal challenges, economic challenges, and the list goes on and on and on. This is not a new topic to any of us. What is and remains very important is how we understand leadership in these complex, in a very complex terrain that I think society is operating, and business as well. So it's our intent to really try and understand leadership better, because we believe the theory and practice of leadership has not really served the world well, given the complex problems that we are facing still today. So at the Institute, the best way for us as academics and as an institute located within a university is to do it through our research and obviously our educational offerings. So we have a PhD in leadership that's been running over the past, I would say, 8 years or so. We've graduated roughly 14 PhDs already, focusing on leadership within a broader scope of environmental challenges, societal challenges, and broader economic challenges. We also have 2 master's degrees, one in responsible leadership and one in development practice, that is mostly based on the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, you might probably ask why you are here, as Elma already stated, and Dr. Tumeka, my colleague, will be talking more about that in a minute. But we believe that we need to rethink leadership as not something only within the hands of individuals, the individual leader as such, but also we need to see leadership emerging through other processes as well. Through collaborations, through legislation, through policies, through movements, social movements, that also, in our opinion, should be seen as forms of leadership. And this is where we get to this morning's session, and that is that professions play a leadership role. So we have to move beyond the fact that we're looking for leadership only in individuals. We should look at processes, as I said, but also professions. So why the accounting profession? We're not picking on the accounting profession, but we do believe the accounting profession plays a vital role in being what we think are critical custodians of the public interest in society. Obviously, there are many other professions that play equally important roles, like the legal profession, the medical profession, etc., etc. But we believe the real heavy lifting takes place within the accounting profession, as you can see how big changes and shifts in society also often are facilitated by the broader accounting profession. So we thought it appropriate to start focusing on the accounting profession and to see how we can also create a movement within the profession to really make use their skill and their power to leverage significant changes in society towards what we believe should be a just society and a just world. So that's why we are here. It's not by picking on the accounting profession, but actually respecting the fact that the accounting profession can and should play such a significant role in broader society. So that's all from my side. I know that you will enjoy this conversation this morning. We have a wonderful guest speaker who has written a wonderful book and has played a big role in society. But let me not talk too much about Rob. I think it's over to Thumeka, to Elma, to be the coordinator of the program and introduce the next speaker. Thank you very much again for you that decided to be here this morning. We do appreciate that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Prof. I think that helps us understand where the degree is located. For those who are thinking it might be GIBS, what the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute is all about and how that process works. Now, next up, we're going to have program lead, Dr. Thumeka Matshoba Ramuetsisi, who's going to talk a little bit more about the program. But just to give you a bit of background on who she is and what she's done, she's a registered auditor with the Independent Regulatory Board for Auditors, chartered accountant as well, with a member of SAICA, senior researcher at the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute, with both extensive professional background in the accounting and auditing profession, as well as a very strong academic background. So putting those two together make her perfect program lead for a program of this nature. So without further ado, Dr. Thumeka, please join me on stage. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you, Elma. I prefer not to stand behind objects, so I'll stand in front of you rather. So good morning to everyone, this really chilly winter morning. I'm really honored to have you today at our event, where I think we've provided you with a very tasty breakfast, but I'm also going to share some info on our MPhil program. So as Elma mentioned, I've been granted the pleasure of being the program lead for the MPhil Business Management specializing in critical accounting. I am a member of SAICA, the CASA, and I am a member of the IRBA as a registered auditor, and I'm very much engaged in the public practice. So this is why this program is very exciting for me. I think as members of the profession of various generations, so those more recently qualified, the very experienced or older, and the more experienced but young, like me, we have all seen a corporate scandal or two, or more, in our lifetime. I recall the first one that I really took note of, Enron. This happened in my senior years at university, and it caused a big global wave. It was massive. For me, the most disturbing thing to learn about it was that one of the largest accounting firms at the time, Arthur Andersen, was a part of the scandal. It blew my mind that the profession that I had been learning is so ethical and has the public's interest as its primary focus, was a part of this, down to destroying evidence that implicated them. Needless to say, that scandal severely damaged the reputation of the accounting profession and highlighted the need for stricter auditing standards and regulation, which of course came about. But this was not the last to rock our world. Globally, we've had Lehman Brothers, Volkswagen emission scandal, and Wirecard, to name a few. To bring it closer to home, we have had African Bank, Tongaat Hulett, and of course, VBS and Steinhoff. You forgot about that one. I emphasize the last few because this is where I think it clicked for most of us how broad a societal impact these corporate scandals can have. It is not just those who are perceived as the wealthy investors on the stock exchange that are affected, but also us regular people who have our life savings and retirements invested with these companies. And the effects can be devastating to entire families and their futures. Yes, the accountant's or auditor's involvement is not always fraudulent. Sometimes the issue is negligence or doing only the bare minimum to get the audited report over the line and not taking care to consider the wider societal impacts. This, for me, is when I take a pause and consider how we do our work as professionals. This is when I start to wonder whether our education and training is really preparing us to serve the public interest. This is when I even ask, do we even know who this public whose interest we are serving is? In her 2013 paper titled, Balancing the Public and Private Interest, a Dilemma of the Accounting Profession, Adriana Tudor reminds us that, according to the legitimacy theory, society gives legitimacy to a profession only when its value system is similar to that of the society in which it operates. So there's a social contract between society and that profession. And if the social contract is broken, via the trust that is broken, for example, by the accounting profession, then society will be forced to seek other solutions to the purpose it believes accountants serve in the realm of trustworthy and reliable corporate reporting information. Thus, as aptly put by Twyford, Musundwa, Tanima, and George in their recent Meditari publication, the accounting profession finds itself at a critical juncture, facing urgent calls to transcend its traditional technocratic boundaries and embrace a broader societal and moral responsibility. Our response to those calls is this MPhil degree. Through our innovative program, we focus on the public interest responsibility of the accounting profession to explore this concept through the merging of scholarly discourse and practice. The program offers students a unique opportunity to problematize and challenge conventional accounting norms and critique their own understanding of the role accountants play in shaping organizations and society. Our goal is to empower graduates to become socially conscious accounting professionals. We aim to extend critical accounting discourse beyond academic corridors and scholarly journals, bringing it into the field through practical engagement. We believe that this program is ideal for all accounting professionals who aspire to contribute to a socially responsible and ethically sound profession, whether they are in academia, public practice, or commerce and industry. There are 4 key features of our program that I want to highlight. The first is critical examination. Students are encouraged to delve deeply into the ethical, social, and economic dimensions of the accounting profession, equipping them with the tools to challenge the status quo. Second, interdisciplinary approach. The program integrates various course modules, fostering a comprehensive understanding of critical accounting issues. Third is practical application. Beyond academic study, the program aims to bring critical accounting discourse into the field, involving practitioners to challenge and improve current practices. Lastly is empowerment for change. Graduates will be equipped to advocate for responsible accounting practices and enact meaningful changes within the profession. To quote Tudor 2013 once again, society's trust in the accounting profession can only be strengthened if the accounting profession itself steps up its efforts to achieve the objective of serving the public interest. I therefore invite you to come and join us in reshaping the future of accounting and become a leader in advocating for social impact and ethical practices within the profession. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tumeka. I mean, I never studied accounting, but I'm rethinking my entire life. after hearing that. I think it's very important for us to recognize that as public society, we tend to ask ourselves when we see these different scandals happening, we ask ourselves, what are people doing about it? What's being done? And this is a critical example of what's being done. And that's why it's so important that the message is sent out there that even if you are not applying, you have in mind those who will need a program like this in their various institutions. So thank you very much for that, Tumeka. We're going to go over now to our keynote speaker, who is a former editor of the Financial Mail and author of Steinheist and The Grand Scam. Now, after earning a law degree, Rob decided to take on fraud and corporate governance at Business Day. And after a stint as editor of the Business Times, he was appointed editor of the Financial Mail in 2016. He's won a Nieman Fellowship to Harvard in 2011, as well as Financial Journalist of the Year 4 times. He is currently writing for the Financial Times and is the co-author of the new media business that is launching in September called Currency. I'm sure you've heard or seen his work, and now we get to see it happen live. So I'm very excited for this session. If we could put our hands together for Rob, that would be great.
Hi guys, great to be here. Can you hear me? I mean, I obviously have the world's deepest voice, so you should be able to. It's not. In the first hour, I'm going to talk about the use of grammar in audit reports. No, I'm just joking. I'm not going to. So I'm going to talk, I suppose, about media, where we sit. Like Elmer said, I did 2 weeks of articles as a lawyer and decided that life should be longer than that, and left for journalism, which I found fascinating. And I gravitated towards the kind of stories where, you know, the lines between what companies say they're going to do and what they actually do is somewhat grey. And I think I immediately stumbled across cases like Enron, which was the first obvious one. Then in South Africa, Tygon, and Regal Bank I found particularly fascinating. I mean, one of the first bigger stories I covered was the audit reports that Ernst & Young did for Regal Bank, and I found this a fascinating story. I just couldn't believe it happened because as a journalist, as somebody who reads newspapers, you think that companies are fairly impregnable. They operate with high governance standards, and what goes out is exactly what the company's agreed upon. But when I read about how Jeff Levenstein, the former head of Regal Bank, had audited reports for Regal Bank, and then he just published something different in the newspapers. And of course, this caused consternation at Ernst & Young. They couldn't believe this had happened, and then had various crisis meetings and decided, well, it's within the materiality issue. It's only 10%. It's fine. It's fine. And I thought, that is a staggering thing to happen. You actually, it says so much about your ethics and your governance and your honesty when you just publish different numbers in the newspapers. Ernst & Young were then called to a disciplinary at IRBA, or the predecessor, the PAB, in which they pretty much got off. But I just thought it was for me, it was a blinding flash of insight into how things can go so wrong in the auditing profession, which has a huge impact on society. I suppose that was one aspect of Regal, so it was no real surprise when Jeff Levenstein was then arrested and convicted a few years later. I think when you're doing those kind of things, that's probably not the first time you've stepped over the line. So media, I think that media I have two here, so I can actually see what I'm going to say. The media, I think, has done a pretty good job of holding a lot of these companies to account. I think you have Enron, I think it was, the media did quite a lot. We had Wirecard, we had, you had in South Africa, you had EOH, which Ahmed Mogani did pretty good things about, VBS, which was Daily Maverick. SPAR, I think, had a bit of a governance fracas 2 years ago, and I think Financial Mail did pretty well in holding those guys to account. So the media, I think, has a unique vantage point, and I think incentive to hold people accountable that you don't have with many others. I think that, for example, you have, this was a really fascinating slide about the media gets it right occasionally and occasionally gets it very wrong. And the one I particularly liked here is the 1911 prediction from the Royal College of Medicine, Royal College of Surgeons in England, saying useless outer toes will diminish in the long term, paving the way for a one-toed race, which I think is fantastic. I hope that happens. I want to be the guinea pig for that. And in 1999, Microsoft executive Dick Brass said that newspapers will be extinct. And I think to some extent, we're on the way there at the moment. We've had newspapers falling all over, and you have some of them still going on, but they're not doing the job, I think, to hold people to account. Primarily, not because the journalists don't want to do that. A lot of people join the profession because they see a way to make a difference in society, to speak, ideologically and idealistically, and perhaps like a 14-year-old still. I still believe that's important. But you just don't have the scope to do it anymore. You're chasing, if you look at a lot of the newspapers we have now, they're just basically filling space with reprints of SENS announcements, which is no good to anyone. Adds no value to society. It's not telling anyone anything new. It's not illuminating the world of economics around us. And so that's why I left Financial Mail, decided to do something else, start this new business called Currency, which I think is hopefully going to dig into that kind of stuff. So, I mean, in terms of the media's unique incentive, I mean, I think that our job, it depends a lot like you were saying about how you view your client, I suppose. I think the media generally, or certainly should view the client as the public. That's who you're serving, fundamentally. I'll put on the right one. So your client should be the public, essentially. And you see it go wrong when the media thinks that they're interviewing people, and it's about buffing the ego of the executive who you're interviewing. You misconstrue who you're actually speaking to. And I think that auditors, when they view the clients not as the company that they're working for, who pay their audit bills, but as the public, it leads to a very different outcome. I have quite a few friends who are auditors, and the process can be quite lots of friction involved. I think when you expect there to be, when you think of the people who are paying your salary in that case as your boss. And it's a very difficult way to think about it. But auditors themselves have a very different environmental and social space, I think, in our governance framework that not many other people occupy. I think the media also does that. We should be thinking about the public as our clients, and hence that's our job. The worst media, I think, that I see, the interviews you see, it's with people who are basically not asking the hard questions of people because they think that it's about protecting this particular person, as opposed to standing in the way of your audience and saying, what would they like to know? And then you lead to a much better outcome. And I think those interviews are the better ones. Analysts, for example, I mean, they've done some fantastic things. I think that, in the case of Tongard, for example, which was an analyst at Investec, who talked about the value destruction before Peter Stadi, who was the CEO, resigned at the company, and said that he needs to resign and leave the company, and this is the value destruction. And Investec forced him to apologize to Peter Stadi, the man who is now facing criminal charges over Tongard. And I think that is the confusion with who your client is in that particular instance. You think of the client as not the people out there you're servicing, because it's often nebulous to think of who they are, but as opposed to the individual, the CEO, who you don't want to antagonize. Steinhoff. I mean, I wrote quite a bit about Steinhoff. Obviously, I mean, I think that there were massive red flags at Steinhoff. There were also analysts there who asked the hard questions at JP Morgan and were hauled to Steinhoff's headquarters and bullied by the entire board, actually, who just couldn't believe this uppity analyst was saying very mean things about this wonderful guy called Marcus. I wrote a book, Steinheist, about it, and then after that, one of Marcus's nephews called me, who disliked the guy intensely, and he said, "Hey, you made two big errors in the book, eh?" He says, "Firstly, you talked about the wizards in the furniture industry, and the next one will be the first. And then you misspelt his name everywhere, eh?" Because Marcus had a favorite term to use, which he called everyone this. I'm not going to say it now because it's just terrible, and that's what all his relatives called him. Okay. So, I mean, the point about Steinhoff is there were many things that you could have picked up upon, but I think if you weren't thinking critically about it, I think if you didn't have a degree of professional skepticism, I think you would have overlooked many of those things. On this previous slide, that thing at the bottom was from a report by a hedge fund called Portsea about 8 months before Steinhoff collapsed. I mean, it completely decoded the accounts over the previous years, talked of numerous errors, and said why Steinhoff was a fantastic shorting opportunity. And I think if you look through the accounts in a critical sense, it's very different to how people operated at that company at the time. And certainly Marcus Jooste would bully the accountants, Deloitte particularly, massively in that particular instance. I mean, the week before he resigned, he was standing outside the offices. Deloitte's auditors were in there, basically calling them all kinds of names and talking about how scared they were to do anything. I mean, it was brutal. But Steinhoff specifically had measures in place to go around the accounting measures to mitigate this. They had 6 or 7 accountants in different groups of accountants in different jurisdictions to ensure nobody had a holistic view of this. And that's before you went to the lengths, before you look at the lengths they went to actually create this fraud, which was immense. So I think Steinhoff, to some extent, it doesn't prove how bad accountants were at all, because I think in the end, the only reason Marcus Jooste resigned was because Deloitte refused to sign off the financials. It was Deloitte who actually sparked the thing. Had they signed the financials for the year to September 2017, Jooste never would have resigned. Steinhoff might never have, the Steinhoff fraud might never have emerged if he'd been able to fill the giant holes that he'd created in the books. And the extent of the fraud, the fact that they were able to essentially swindle 106 billion rand in fictitious profits over a decade, was only possible because of the extreme lengths he went to make sure that they swindled and duped the auditors. So in a sense, I mean, I don't think it's the worst. I think that there are far more egregious examples of accounting errors, and I think Tongaat, to some extent, is far worse. It's far more obvious. I think it obviously makes a good example for mandatory audit firm rotation. I think the Tongaat case, they've been auditors for many decades. I know that's in the audit industry, there are many auditors who don't believe in that, but I think you form very close friendships in this particular industry between the auditor and the company executives. And I think if you have a look at what happened at Tongaat, there are many instances where that seems to be the case. The evaluation of biological assets, for example, the sugarcane roots was fairly blunt, and it was contrary to what was happening at Illovo Sugar and many others in the industry at the time. I think PwC, for example, they did a forensic report into this, and they had some very, very interesting insights into it. I mean, I think they talk there about the culture of deference and the lack of challenge at Tongaat that resulted in employees following instructions on accounting practices without questioning the basis for those decisions. And I think Gavin Hudson, the former CEO who then left, who took over from Peter Stadi and was then at Tongaat for a while and helped mop up the mess to some extent, he talked about how essentially the public should be holding companies to account. This is the role that we should play. He didn't think the public had done a very good job at Tongaat, the shareholders, the stakeholders, and he felt that a lot more could have happened, and this needn't have got to the stage with Tongaat that it ultimately did. You know, he said we all have a role to play in keeping everyone honest, and I think that is one of the failures from the public side that we see as journalists. Obviously, I've looked at many frauds. I love fraud stories, more so than the investors who lose the money, strangely enough. But I think that there are a couple of things that I think that I've seen on it, and I think professional skepticism is the one overriding thing that I've seen fail. You see it fail from the media side the whole time. You completely believe what people say. You know, the trust but verify principle is just often not there in the media space, and that's partly because when you have a feeling about something being wrong, there's just no time anymore to interrogate that. Auditors have more time and a greater social responsibility than us in the media do. So we'd like to believe they get it right far more often, and then we're shocked when they don't. Tongaat. So what David Willem said, who was the former CFO of African Bank, who became a bit of a shareholder activist in Tongaat and other places, is he said, so much of it boils down to judgment, and a young, inexperienced auditor is no match for a dominant and forceful executive who can wrap you up in technical justifications and jargon. And that pretty much was Peter Stadi. I think the companies I've looked at, you look at the comparisons between Jeff Levenstein, for example, Marcus Jooste, Peter Stadi. There was a very dominant CEO who it was his way or the highway, and if you didn't do it correctly, he would really hammer you. And I think it's difficult, as certainly in Steinhoff's case, even the CFO, who was fairly young when he was appointed, appears to have had the wool pulled over his eyes to some extent, and he had a greater responsibility to do more, but he did what Marcus Jooste wanted, which is very difficult. Bernard Gullis, the former head of URBA, talking about the issue of fraud and the expectation gap, because that's the big issue, is that how do you resolve what the public expects of auditors and what actually happens on the ground? I mean, he said that, obviously this issue has been much in the news in recent years, but, his view was auditors aren't fraud investigators, but it's no longer good enough for auditors to just say their auditing standards don't expect this from us. So I've spoken to Donald Bryden quite a lot, who did the investigation into auditing standards in the UK and what can be done to close this expectation gap. And what he said is that no one can expect a zero failure approach in these things. And I think certainly what Christo Wiese said, who was the chair of Steinhoff, is that there will always be another Steinhoff. It'll be a different one, but there'll always be another Steinhoff. But it's to give yourself a better chance of detecting these things. He said it's important to put yourself in a position where if there is a major fraud going on, you generally spot it rather than not. And I think in a lot of these cases, there's the legal aspect. Are you doing what's legally demanded of you? But there's also the kind of the Sunday Times front page test, which is that you don't want to be on the front page of the Sunday Times for something that's ethically incorrect or dodgy. And certainly Ernst & Young's case involving Regal Bank, you don't want to be the guy who's on the front page where the auditors say, well, yeah, I mean, he published different financials, but it wasn't that wrong and it was generally fine, because it looks bad, even if you can make an argument around materiality on it. So I think that's an important thing. Rueda Redfern, who's taken over at Deloitte, I mean, she said that auditors, in the case of Tongaat, placed a higher level of trust on the validity of the information and the authenticity of the engagement. And I think that fundamentally goes to the issue of professional skepticism. Mervyn King, who it seems has a new book out about how great he is, I'm sure, said, for him, were Steinhoff's directors sufficiently skeptical, and the auditors? And ultimately, it'll be a question of fact. Did they see things that were red flags? Did they act on it? For example, was the constant growth and revaluation of subsidiaries and of the properties, was that a red flag to anyone? And what happens as a result of it? And I think that I think is fundamentally what it falls down upon in a lot of cases. You can have fantastic principles, but if you're just not thinking skeptically, if you're not taking a critical viewpoint on it, then things can bypass you. And I think that's why this is such a fabulous course. And I'm certainly going to register myself next year. And just the final slide I had is, I mean, obviously this is why I think it's a fundamentally important course. I mean, I think that as you mentioned, trust is the big issue, and trust in the business sector has fallen precipitously in recent times as a result of Steinhoff and various other issues. I think that we live in a country where we have so few people who are in jobs who already have a distrust of the sector to deliver the better lives that the promise of capitalism and capital promises, and that hasn't happened. We have, I think, 27% of people in the country are actually in jobs, which creates a massive amount of people outside of the commercial sector who don't interact on a daily basis, and that's people inclined to believe the conspiracy theories that politicians tell us about the way capital works. And I think that there's a massive job to prove that we can do what we say we will, and certainly that you don't have instances of companies, executives just benefiting themselves and walking off with massive amounts of loot when they shouldn't do it. Nicky Newton-King, the former JSE CEO, said that South Africa had an unblemished reputation amongst emerging markets before Steinhoff for having the strongest management and ethical corporate standards. And now, to her, it just looked like we're one of many, many bad countries. So the notion of South Africa as this sort of fascinating, this great example with sophisticated corporate governance standards was tarnished quite a lot. And I think that's why it's critical for the guardians of governance, as she called it, to stand up and reassert its authority and prove that it is actually doing what it says it will. And each time there's a VBS and Steinhoff, that diminishes and trust diminishes. And I think that's the real issue, especially in a country where you have to say, if the majority of people look to our NPA, to our police, to our law authorities to be telling us when somebody's done something wrong, that isn't happening. And I don't think that's going to happen for a while. The case of Tygon in 2002, which is 22 years ago, the CEO of Tygon, Gary Porrett, got arrested, and he's still on trial. I mean, that's staggering. And the level of sophistication in the police to actually deal with these corporate crimes is minimal. I had a case where during sort of the Gupta era, my phone records were accessed by somebody, and it was on a website. It's owned by some dodgy kind of Gupta-linked PI. And this website showed calls between Trevor Manuel, myself, and another journalist. And it was essentially, I'd called Trevor Manuel to ask him to write a tribute to Ahmed Kasrada when he died. So it was fairly legitimate. We weren't organizing all of Stellenbosch at the time. That happened later, obviously. But it was on this website talking about how this is validation for the fact that, for the accusation that Trevor Manuel and WMC is controlling the media and controlling the message. So I'd called up Rob Shooter at MTN, and I said to him, how is it that my phone records are on this website? How does that happen? So he said, well, we'll look at it. And he called me back the next day and said, well, actually what happened is that we found one person who accessed all 3 of your records. We spoke to her. She admitted it. There's a payment into her account from this Eskom private detective agency. You can see it in her account. And it was only 2,000 Rand that it cost. By the way, if you guys consider, if you want someone's phone records, it's not expensive. And she admitted it. She signed a statement. So we laid a case with Hawks. And the Hawks person we spoke to said, this is the most sophisticated thing I've seen. And I thought, like, that is the bluntest fraud. How are you at the Hawks going to unravel Steinhoff, going to unravel, state capture, actually, if this confounds you? So that's why I think that these guardians of governance, the auditors, and I will say the media there, although I do think the auditors have a higher responsibility and obviously skills, but I do think the guys relied upon to tell the public what's happening and to provide verification and boost trust have to do a better job. And that's why I really think this is a fantastic course. And when I'm there next year, I can give you this feedback in person. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say. And happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that, Rob. I'm going to ask if you could please grab a seat. And we're going to definitely do some Q&A. Thank you for those insights. I think it's always fascinating to hear it from the mouth of the person who has been doing all the reporting. I think it's great to hear that. And I think you've really provided context as to the importance of a program of this nature. And so we're going to have quick Q&A. I have some questions that I'm burning to ask, but we're also obviously going to open up to the floor. And you can ask questions as well pertaining to the pertaining to Rob, pertaining to the program itself, if there's certain questions that you might have about the module structure, how it's delivered, etc., etc. Great image to leave us on right there. I think my first question is going to come to you, Rob, because just as you were walking off, you were speaking about public interest, right? And I think it's important for us to understand, how do you actually define public interest in the context of the accounting profession?
Well, I mean, I certainly think you talking about, if you look too broadly, I think it can be kind of nebulous and difficult to think about. But if you think about, I hate the term stakeholders because it sounds like jargon, but certainly employees, certainly all the people in the wider communities affected by a particular company's activities, obviously staff, obviously employees, obviously shareholders. It's a wide ambit of activity that I think affects, and then obviously when you look at those particular issues, it then broadens widely. Do you have systemic issues that might be unveiled by a particular issue, which can, in the case of Steinhoff, in the case of Tongaat, VBS, it can have ramifications for all of society. So public interest, I think, it extends as broad as the particular case is. And again, I think it's a fairly case-based issue. You have a look at a particular case and see who is this affecting. Pensioners, for example, in the case of public listed companies. I tend to look as broadly as possible, generally, to see where the impact has been.
And I think you speak about how interconnected it is as well. And so my question to you, Thembeka, would be, how can accountants balance the conflicting interests of these different networks? So the conflicting interests of investors, of clients, of regulators, and the general public in trying to be more honest and present?
Sure, okay. So I think actually the main interest to balance is between our personal interest and what probably we should view as public interest. So I think overall, actually, that the interests of, let's say, investors, general public, are kind of similar, okay? If you are an accountant and then also an auditor, the accountant, your job is to ensure that your reporting is accurate, right? So I'll use a bit of accounting jargon: valid, accurate, and complete. Okay, so all the numbers in there are real, nothing is made up. And then your job, let's say from an audit side, is to check that. So you can give that assurance that yes, indeed, what has been presented to you is valid, accurate, and complete. The issue comes when, as Rob said, you're being paid by this other person whose interest might be slightly different, okay? Because now I either want to increase my share price, or I want to, I want to look good. I want to look good, and looking good does not always mean telling the truth. Okay, but I think for investors, as an investor with the JSE private company, whatever, I want to know that how my money's been used, and that I'm getting the return on the investments. As the public, I want to know that whatever is being presented to me is correct. So I think what happens is and I'm going to say we, because I'm in public practice. These are my daily problems. You are being paid by somebody who is the one trying to present, but you are trying to give assurance for the people who are on the other side looking in. So it's a bit more of I'd say an inside job. Okay, so we, as the people in the profession, we really need to sit and say, well, if I actually do my work properly and make sure that I'm not busy thinking, oh, I don't want to antagonize the client, or I want to make sure I still have this audit next year. Trust me, if you put that aside, you will do the right thing. Yeah.
No, thanks for that point. Rob, I'm going to come back to you again. You were mentioning how basically it's very easy to get phone records. And, it's not a hard procedure. And so my question would be, when we think about these scandals, and you've got extensive experience as to scandals that happened a long time ago and how they've happened in recent times, are they getting worse? Are they getting better? And what do they actually tell us about the health of this profession and where it's progressing?
I mean, I think that the scandals you had in the past were obviously a lot blunter and less sophisticated. I think it's a testament to the ingenuity of our executives that they've become far smarter in committing these. I mean, we really have world-class executives. So you had the fruit milk thing in the 1970s or 80s, where it was very blunt. You had Lejeune, which was also pretty blunt, essentially. And that was an accounting scandal. Regal Bank was also incredibly blunt. Steinhoff was far smarter. And then I think, Tongaat, the minutiae of valuation of biological assets, backdating deals, I mean, I think that they've become far more sophisticated. I think that our audit profession is much better, far smarter. I think the guys I engaged with in the 2000s, early 2000s, compared to now, people think about these issues a lot more. And I think they also understand the kind of professional fallout for them of not seeing this kind of thing. In a couple of stories I've done, I've had auditors come to me outside of the individual companies as whistleblowers, essentially, and say, this is going on, this is not the right thing to do, this is not the right thing happening, you should look at this, you should do that. I mean, the story I wrote on last year about SOEs, certainly Transnet, changing their accounting policies when it came to reporting of fruitless and wasteful expenditure, stuff like that. It was auditors who said to me, they want to do this. This is not right. We need to talk about this in public. And that's actually what should happen. You should have people from the industry who trust you to say, I feel like this is an important issue and this is what it means. And to sort of blow the whistle on bad things happening. And that happens far more. I think that's, the extent, like I said, the extent to which Deloitte was instrumental in Steinhoff being uncovered it's very important. I think it wasn't like so many others. So it wasn't the case of Enron where Arthur Andersen actually shredded records. I mean, they were actually trying to uncover this. So I think we don't, we like to beat up on auditors, and that's for a good reason. They're one of the few bodies in our governance network that actually has accountability mechanisms. That has IRBA. You don't have that for directors. Who's held the directors of Steinhoff accountable?
Good point. And I think what you're saying is as well that in an organization, in an auditing firm or whatever, there need to be more responsible auditors than there are not responsible auditors, so that when the time does come, there is somewhat power in numbers. Because I think one of people's biggest fears is I'll be the only one who is a whistleblower and no one else will back me up. And I think that's what a program like this is trying to do. And so coming back to the program, Thumeka, what inspired the development of this program? Was there a personal experience that you had, or is it a long calling? What inspired this?
Well, I didn't develop the program, so I can't speak to the inspiration of the development of it. But I can certainly speak to why I believe it is a good, a good program. And I think for me, it is, my personal experience in the profession. I have, over the years that I've been That's about 19 years now. So I started when I was 10 years old. I have seen a lot, right? And when I say seen a lot, it doesn't mean that I've seen big frauds. Those are external. But to me, I've actually, from even as a trainee, you'd see how, as a trainee, you're like really excited and you think you found something, and you'd be like, hey, manager or, senior trainee, I found this. And, it would circle back to, it's not material. It's not material. And yes, of course, there is an argument to be made for materiality, but a bit of disillusionment came with that, in that, so it's only important if it's, a big amount of money, but, it could not be a big amount of money, but still indicate a problem, and then you find yourself also being like, okay, of course, it's about materiality, right? But then I had to also go through, a process where, when I was lecturing auditing, for example, at university, telling students that there's this thing called materiality. So when, an error is discovered and, it's 2.5 million, but our materiality is 6, then we don't worry about it. You're not thinking, okay, but what further than that, right? And coming into a space where now I am training, future accountants and auditors, and also telling them, fine, we've got this concept of materiality. However, and this has always been there, we've got the number and we've also got qualitative materiality. And I think our profession needs to focus a lot more on that qualitative aspect, where we ask the deeper questions. So, okay, fine. It's not going to change the decisions of the users of the financials. That's what we always say. And the users, who are we thinking of? Investors. But there are times we actually need to really interrogate. We can't stop at, okay, it doesn't, it's below the threshold, for example. So we need to, with the younger people we are already training into the profession, get them out of that mindset and think broader about, well, what else could this indicate? And it goes back to, you mentioned it as well, around the expectation gap. The job of the auditor is not to find fraud. Okay, yes, we're not forensic auditors, but we've got to keep our eyes open and our senses alive to what can happen. And then also, when we do find something that is perhaps suspicious, let's not shred the documents. Let's not aid in debate. But I think the big thing for me is really that, through my experience, a number of years, I've realized that we don't do enough introspection, thinking about what we really are doing. And I count myself in that as a practitioner as well. So I'm excited to go through this, as much as I might not be the one studying it, but to have the conversations and start leading our profession to the place where we all know it should be. As I said, trust. If we don't have that, I'm telling you now, all these monies we think we're getting, they're going to disappear very quickly, and nobody's going to think we're useful.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to look to the audience now to see if we have any questions. Oh, okay. All right, so I see I can note those 2 hands. I'm going to bring this mic to you and then get another microphone.
Rob, thanks for that. I really enjoyed it. And I think the one thing that you didn't mention was the fact that the Tongaat Audit Committee chair was then appointed as the head of the IRBA, which seems completely absurd, especially around mandatory audit firm rotation. And you also wrote about it. And for me, it baffles how that could happen. The most important body then appointing this person who's sort of implicated in all of it. It doesn't make any sense to me. So maybe one or two thoughts around that. I want to ask you a second question. In my understanding, most of the movements that the accounting profession has, or initiatives to reform itself, has usually come from the top down, like the integrated reporting movement, your favorite Judge King, all of these types of movements. which is a lot of the times it's trying to stay ahead of the curve to not get these things regulated, etc. But what interests me specifically is movements from the bottom up, especially in terms of seeking reform. So I want to know whether you have knowledge of bottom-up movements in this case, or social movements, and if you don't, if you got lots of cash and time, what would you do in terms of a social movement to try and reform the profession?
I'd stay off Twitter. No, firstly, on Janita John, it was staggering that she was appointed, and I think it's, she had a particular view of how she had tried to bring this to people's attention at Tongaat, but I don't think she'd done enough. And then I think for the fact that URBA's board to nominate her as the chair or the CEO, illustrated an immense tin ear for the social license aspect, and the fact that society was feeling quite outraged about the various frauds that were happening, and felt that there'd been a lack of accountability. And in this accountability vacuum, it was reckless of the board, I think, to do that. I think that I don't know how they did it. They just underestimated the extent of public sentiment. And I think that a lot of the audit firms, that they're not in touch with what the wider society is feeling about specific issues or thinking about it. And, obviously you have to run your company, but I do think that it goes to that issue you mentioned of social license and building trust. And I think that if you want to rebuild trust in the audit profession, it says a lot about the quality of URBA's board at the time that they thought they could do this by hiring the person who was in charge of Tongaat's audit committee. I mean, it's a staggeringly out of touch moment. And I'm glad that they no longer have that board, because it was a staggering decision that I still think illustrates the extent to which a lot of people in the corporate sector are entirely dislocated from what's happening in society. On the second part, I mean, I speak to individual auditors, but I think it's quite it's like the legal profession to some extent. It's a fairly disempowering profession. You start at the bottom, you are working like a slave, you have very little voice in what happens, and individual auditors have a lot to say when you speak to them, but for one thing, the ones who are in influential corporates, they are very averse to risking their jobs as they would, and I think that it's not really. The structure of the industry is very hierarchical and doesn't play very well when it comes to building up social movements from the bottom at all. As for me, what I would do with lots of money, I wouldn't be here. I'd be on an island somewhere. No. I mean, I do think that I like the media space because I think it can influence things. It's obviously reckless, obviously irresponsible sometimes, but it does have a lot of influence. We write stuff, politicians, people who with power tend to read it, and changes can be made. I think it's important to use the media more. People who want to say stuff. I think people are averse to it because they see how badly it can go wrong when you have responsible journalism. But I think that it's meant to reflect society and a mirror of society, and that's what we're trying to do more of. I wish more auditors were more outspoken, but it generally never happens for very good reasons, protecting their professional careers. I wish it were. You must have great ideas on it, but better than mine, I'm sure.
Thanks, Rob. Kind of closely linked to what Peter was talking about and referring to, and I was actually expecting him to talk more about the whole issue around power, because I know that Peter is very interested in the topic. So let's just, if you can reflect a bit on the whole power asymmetry issue within broader society, because let's face it, the auditing profession and big business is a very powerful machinery and engine. It's very difficult to try and balance power between that machinery and then, let's call it society as a whole, because society in South Africa as a whole is not well organized. So if you say the public interest, it becomes a very vanilla type statement of, okay, there's the broader public. But who represents the public? And if there is some level of representation, obviously beyond the role of media, for example, but who represents the public? And will we ever be at a position where the asymmetries, the power asymmetries are being evened out, given the fact that even on top of that society at the moment in South Africa worries about jobs, worries about basic stuff, and not so interested in the so-called corporate scandals out there. So will this power asymmetry not always, continue until the end of the day? And unless if there's a way to mobilize society more as a coherent voice, but yet on the other side, society is not well organized. And I'm not even referring to NGOs as such, because that's also a completely different ball game. So I'm just keen to hear your views on, and it's very closely related to what Peter asked in your previous point, but how do we balance that asymmetry out?
Well, I mean, from my side, it's very difficult because, if you believe that people behave largely according to the incentives they have, the incentives of big business and the corporate sector is to look after their interests, protect what they define as their stakeholders, which is mostly the CEO and the board, and others. And it's very difficult because the incentives of the public, say shareholder activists, is tiny, minuscule. You go to a board meeting, you get completely humiliated, like Theo Botha did before he hung up his hat. You have nobody really representing the public interest, and it's quite, and it is completely scattered. You have labor unions, but to some extent they're also out of touch at the moment and have lost a lot of relevance in society, so they're not performing that job. Pension funds, I think, have a massive opportunity. They have a massive role in terms of shareholder activism, and they don't use it. And I think that the PIC is potentially the worst. They have could have a massive influence on social good in this country, and they don't use it at all. They don't say anything at AGMs. They refuse to speak to anyone, really, and that's a massive missed opportunity on their side. So I think it just hasn't worked out particularly well at the moment. I mean, I had a few other thoughts on it, but it's very difficult to leverage that, I think. And financial literacy is a massive issue too. I mean, the fact that we have, the FSCA said 51% financial literacy, people don't relate the corporate scandal of Steinhoff to their own personal circumstance. And it's very difficult to do. You relate that to FDI. It's such an intangible root there. You relate it to pension funds, and because of the fact that our pension fund trustees and the managers are too mute on these issues, we don't see the linkage. We don't see how we can demand that this behavior be stopped. So I think greater sense from our pension funds is a great place to start in a very practical sense. But I think generally people are far too mute. We're a very polite society, and not me, obviously, but other people.
Indeed. Now, I'm just taking note of time. Okay, we're going to do one more question. No, please go ahead. And then we're going to start to round up the session. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. I'll be quick. So it's mostly just, and if you look at the timeline from Enron to Steinhoff as an example for it, there is one big catalyst that comes in, and it is very specifically social media. And I mean, if you're looking at public interest, you're looking at two sides of a coin of social media, because one of it is to crucify people without information, and the other side of it is to have so much more information out there than what used to be out there. So how, from sort of a journalistic position, do you balance the two sides of the social media coin that is there now that maybe used to not be as prevalent?
From my side, well, I mean, the thing is, Twitter, I think, is a noxious place where people exist purely to scream at others and make wild accusations and conspiracy theories. But on the other hand, you do see people looking at, say, Grindrod releases its financial statements. There are people who are quite smart, who have a few things to say, so it's almost a tip-off line. But I think the difference between me and my parents, for example, is that I don't view everything I read on Twitter, if they ever read Twitter, as fact. If somebody tells my dad something, it's like it's a fact. It's like, no. I think we're far smarter about looking at something and discerning what might be true. It's a tip-off line, it's a viewpoint, but I think it needs to be verified. I think it's a useful mechanism, and certainly, you would never have seen, you might not have seen 20 years ago somebody saying anything on Grindrod. You wouldn't think twice about their financial statements. But somebody says something on social media, they talk about it, they post these they say, like, this is what's happening here. You'll think about it. You'll think maybe there's a story there. Maybe it's worth digging into it. And then I think your job as, say, the media space or public representative is to then ask the company, ask people for responses to it. I think that's responsible. You can't just say the wild stuff you say on Twitter. There has to be some kind of a reckoning with what's happening in the social media space. But that's what discerns the media and gives the media more credibility, the ones who will say, is there a reasonable explanation for this? How do we think about this? And provide the real intelligence, not just this happened. I think that's what I would say about that.
Thank you so much for that, Rob. And I think to close off the session, Tumeka, I'm just going to ask, who is the ideal candidate for this program?
The ideal candidate is, of course, somebody who thinks about, this kind of thing, the role of accountants and the profession in society. And in fact, maybe even those who don't really and would like to start thinking about it, or at the very least, you are interested in the future of the profession. You know, you want longevity, you want, you know, to be in a space that remains relevant. Because I'm very concerned that if we don't actually engage in this conversation sooner rather than later, we are going to be in a position where we are fighting to prove that, you know, there's still space for us in society. We are still, you know, playing a crucial and important role. Because if you think about the roots of the profession, it came very much, you know, because there was this sort of separation, you know, because of agency, separation between owners of the businesses and managers of the business. So it was a very, you know, it served a very sort of conscious, socially conscious role. And it's evolved over time to where it is now, where, you know, in description, it's still that, but in practice, some of what we do doesn't really speak to that. So I think this program is actually ideal for anybody who thinks about the role of the profession and wants it to continue having a significant role in society in the future. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Tameka. And with that being said, if you'd like to find out more about the program, please do visit our website, the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute, and you'll be able to find the brochure there. If you want to ask any questions, we are available as well. Email addresses are there. And if you want marketing material that you would like to share with others that you believe should know about a program of this nature, do let us know. Thank you so much for coming and joining us for this information session. If we could give a round of applause to our panelists, that would be great.